Hello. Well, it is very symbolic actually that we start and begin with the final act, the last house on the wheel. For our listeners, this is context that you've reached the final house, and this is the first recording that we're doing. So this moment also marks the first of many that, we sit and breathe into the caliber of the humans that we are sitting with here. Um, where do we begin to find the words to introduce you to Martin Palmer? How may we come to introduce a human that has done so much and touched on so much, has extended their medicine into the world in order to unite and not further fragment? One that in my first encounter with him, I died. More on death later, but in the best ways. This podcast will be the testament of that attempt to find our words. And so much of it, so much of this work has to do with finding, channeling, and summoning the right words. And by right words, I don't mean the words that only just properly convey what it is that I want to say, but that identify the force and energy that I don't even yet realize is at work here. The words that display shimmers of dimensions beyond this one, the words that enchant, flirt, and intoxicate our hearts to return to something we know so well but have forgotten. And that is probably the best way I can begin to introduce Martin Palmer, a wise man, a sage, a wizard that has mastered the gastronomy of language, creating buffets of story that are glazed with words which summon forth portals that reveal these very familiar myths. So welcome, Martin, to the Shapeshifting play. We're so excited to go on this walk with you. Um, yeah.
Thank you, Laila. Thank you very much indeed, and Constance. This is a real pleasure, and I've enjoyed the whole process of getting to know you both, and the sense of that this is really about talking, about language. It's about digging deep. It's about uncovering the meanings that we take for granted, but that actually subconsciously shape us far more than we're aware. So I'm delighted and honoured. Thank you.
We are so
Thank you.
grateful. We are so grateful. Just even in the short time of knowing you, it really has shifted our inner world and what we're creating. And we're just delighted to share your work and your voice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's reimagine what civil society is, right? How do we begin to unravel what civil society looks like, where one is rooted in perhaps more disobedience rather than obedience to state, or whatever that looks like, as an opening conversation here. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the important thing to stress is that the origin of civil society was that it was over against the military society. And it was over against in the what we rather grandly call the Enlightenment. The rest of the world was actually thinking quite a lot at the same time as the Enlightenment, but we claimed that we were the ones who were thinking. In the Enlightenment, it became also a distinction between military law and religious law. So civil society started off very deliberately in saying, this is the people. This is not the leaders. It's not the emperors. It's not the military. It's not the commanders of the navy. It's the people who supposedly the emperor and the kings and the rulers and the military were protecting. But strangely enough, it seemed as though the people had become more servants to those groups than being the purpose of the service of those groups. So civil society, which at that time was considered to be all the sort of civil activities, so religious activities, because we have to remember that the notion that there's a thing called religion and then there's a thing called daily life is a really quite recent invention. For most cultures, indeed for Christian culture in Europe, faith was just how you lived your life. It wasn't just about where you went to church on Sunday or a mosque on Friday or a synagogue on Saturday. So, but it was important. It was this sense that the people were in danger of being overwhelmed and being subsumed by the kingly and imperial powers and by the military. So I think that's increasingly important. I mean, if we take a situation such as the United States, back in the 1950s, you had Eisenhower, the president, saying, our problem is that we have a militarized industrial complex. And even he, as a president, felt he had no control over it. Now, that's exactly why civil society is so important. We are not there just to do the nice things that military and rulers don't do. We're there to make sure that the rulers and the military actually do what we need, not what they need. So I think civil, in that context, is enormously important. And we've slightly lost the sense of what it's not, as well as much of what it is. But what's your sense?
I mean, if we look at the word civil as etymologically, we see that it's belonging to civis, civis belonging to city. And I wonder also how much of that we've, like you speak to, have lost connection to land rather than like city and state. And then how much of that then was birthed citizenship, which is, I don't know, is kind of pledging allegiance rather than relationship. So I think it's again this focusing on what it's not versus what it is. What does allegiance mean, and allegiance to what?
I would agree. I mean, I think, in fairness, the original root of it is much more that it is the people rather than that it's the city. But of course, for there to be a civil society, in a sense, you almost needed a structure that it was part of. And countryside is a very different set of structures. But I think also bear in mind, if we take somewhere like Constantinople, Istanbul, which was the greatest Western city. I mean, the Chinese had cities that were 5 times the size of anything in Europe in the Middle Ages. But if we take somewhere like Constantinople, Istanbul, and you know, I suppose, that Istanbul is simply a version of the Greek phrase going to the city. Istapolis, so it's going to the city. So you have this sense of the city, but bear in mind, 2/3 of Constantinople, Istanbul, was fields and farms. So the separation from farmland and farming and hands on the soil and the city is relatively recent. And I was talking with somebody about the city of Mombasa in Kenya, very, very ancient city that was founded by the Oman kingdom, and then grew into a Portuguese town, and then grew into a British colonial town, and then a post-British colonial town. And she was saying, the problem is we have no open spaces in the city because each group came in and filled the spaces that were there with their own statements. So you have the Swahili world created by the Arab slave traders and that whole world. Then you had the Portuguese coming and building Fort Jesus. Only the Portuguese could think you could call a Fort Jesus. I mean, you know, it's a wee bit odd, if you ask me. Then you have the British arriving and building the British Club and the schools and the gymnasiums and all the rest of it. And then you have independence. And essentially what you've got is a very small city space that has been colonized by different groups in order to express their identity. And I think that's what has happened to many of our cities. The wealthy have taken areas that were open space and built their palaces and their estates and their big houses and their, you know, gated communities and so forth. So we're pushing ourselves further and further away from living in an urban context where the rural is an integral part. Now we expect it to be on the boundaries, on the outside. And I think the move towards green cities, both for mental health, because we know that if you just sit for 5 minutes under a tree, even if it's in the middle of a tiny little park in the middle of an urban area, your heart rate drops. So I think you raise an extremely important issue, which is that our assumption is that cities are crowded, whereas in fact they were originally designed with a lot of space.
I think that speaks so much to, as we're asking, why has this happened? It seems to be this convergence of several things kind of hitting at this one period of time where, like you're talking about, we were separated from the earth, from nature, which we are, and we've so much forgotten our true state, which has a profound effect on our somatics and our nervous system and our understanding of safety. And at the same time, with colonialism, there's this narrative of difference is not safe. It's us versus the other, good versus bad. And then with the military state coming in, it's with our allegiance to these flags or these cities, we're given safety, and I think that there's a great cost to that, to outsourcing that. And when we come back, like you said, to these trees, and when we realize we're in these bodies, and they have this divine intelligence and wisdom, that we can experience individually and together, we start to realize there's an inversion here. There's a narrative going on that may not be true. And it really brings us back to personal agency and sovereignty and vitality in a lot of ways.
I mean, it is very interesting. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament of Christians, Hebrew Bible for the Jews, you have two founding figures. You have obviously Adam and Eve, but they have two children. And Cain, who kills Abel, his brother, is described as the first builder of a city. And Abel is killed because he's the farmer. And his offering is not as wealthy or as powerful as the offering of his brother, who is building cities and trade and so forth. So this tension, I mean, that text was probably finally redacted and written around about 700 BC. But that tension between the potential of the city and the threat of it, or the urban, and the rural, it's very old indeed, very old indeed. And you have in Greek mythology, you have the notion that Knossos, this great center on Crete, was this huge urban setting in which the Minotaur lived and ate people, and you had to send sacrifices from these basically small farming towns of Greece. So that tension, I think, has always been there. I think our problem is that we've lost the sense that it's also got the potential to be the great mixing place, to be itself almost a portal to the divine. So if we look at Chinese belief, the design of anything in Chinese culture is determined still to this day by what's called feng shui, which means the wind and the water, the natural forces. So any Chinese city was laid out originally in relationship to what was already there. It wasn't a tabula rasa. You weren't building something on somewhere where there was nothing. You were building on top of dragons' heads. You were building beside tigers that flowed through the land. The land was alive. It was living. And you had to ask permission to be there. You had no right to be there. And still to this day, if you go through, increasingly now in China, with the return of folk religion in particular, you'll see often by the doorways of houses or shops, there'll be a little plaque which is to the earth god, to the god whose earth this is, and you ask permission, and you make an offering every morning, and you ask permission to be there. And in Christianity, we had something not dissimilar, not quite the same, but we did have this sense of a sort of Christian feng shui. How do you build in order to be in balance and harmony with the forces of nature? So all old churches face east. Why? Partly because you have the image of the rising sun, which is Christ, but also because without sunlight, there's no life. And they have the west, there's almost always a west door in the church. That's because in pre-Christian belief, west was the direction the dead went. So your body would be, the body of the person you are honoring would be brought into the church through the south door. It would be facing east in order to be ready for the resurrection, but it would go out through the west door, echoing this belief that where the sun sets, that's where the souls go. So you have that, and then you have the notion both in Chinese traditional design of settlements and in Christian ones that the north is the direction of danger. And so you would always put a St. Michael's church to the north, because St. Michael, according to the legends, threw Satan out of heaven and protects you by spreading his wings against evil descending upon your city, your village, your abbey, your monastery. Chinese have exactly the same thing. North is the direction of danger, so you build an auspicious tower there to, in a sense, focus that power to beam out to protect you. So we used to design cities believing they could be mirrors of eternity. The Georgians, in the 18th century, built cities across Britain, which were designed to be sort of almost pagan cities in a sense. They built symbols of the sun and the moon. But again, the north was a direction of danger. You were building a sacred city. The problem with the Georgians was, the 18th century, and you can see this in America, in Washington, is that they built for the wealthy only to be part of the sacred. In the Middle Ages, Christianity, and in China in that same period, they built for everyone to be safe. So we've lost confidence in the potential for cities to be sacred, and we've kind of romanticized the countryside. But very often the lovely pictures we get of the countryside with lovely green fields is because they've got so much chemical fertilizers in them. That's why they look nice and green. So we've romanticized the rural at the expense of the city and the urban. And I think we need to rebalance, because Britain was the first country in 1851 to have the majority of people living in cities. First time in the history of the world. Now, that's the norm. That's the norm. 70 to 80% of people live in urban conurbations. So if we haven't got something that gives us a sense of how we can make that potentially sacred, a portal, a place where transformation can take place, we're kind of giving up on the human venture. But I would add a caveat to that, which is that the predominant mythology at the moment is that we're in charge. And that technology and military and wisdom and science will solve everything. You've only got to look at the COPs, the climate COPs, which are huge exercises in mythology. It claims that if we do X, Y, and Z, we can control the environment. I mean, that's a load of nonsense. We have no idea what the long-term effects of industrialization are. What we do know is it's not terribly good, but the assumption that we're in control is very dangerous. And it comes from an attitude in which everything out there is of service to us. And if it isn't for service to us, then there's no point to it. And I remember we had a meeting in Sweden of all the major religious forest-owning faiths. Many of them own forests, they manage them, they're sacred forests, but they're also often commercial forests. And we developed a program with many of the Abrahamic faiths, the Muslims, Jews, Christians, in which the forests that they own became faith-protected forests. So, for example, in Lebanon, the Maronites have two incredibly important oak forests of enormous significance. Those are now Maronite protected forests. In my country, the Church of England has about 10% of the forest land of England. That is protected. It's used, but it's protected. So when we suggested this to the meeting of the faiths, all the Muslim, Jewish, Christian groups kind of went, "Oh yeah, great idea. Yeah, no, we'll make them faith protected in forest." The Shinto almost collapsed with horror. And I said, what's the problem? What's the issue? And they said, but this is nonsense. We don't protect the forests. They protect us. You've got it round the wrong way. And I think that sums up for me, the tension we have. We think we're in control of something that actually we then treat as a commodity, which is actually like the arms of a mother. And we
Absolutely.
treat it like it's a slave.
Yeah, that makes me think so much of like this is exactly the loss of contact with the divine that you're speaking to,
Yes.
and how much of it has to do with like um with our relationship to life and death. Because if things were meant to live and they were meant to also die, and in that honor we had to ask permission, there's a reciprocity, there's a generosity to that relationship, knowing that they'll die and come back. The creation and the relationship is so crucial. And now things are not only commodified, but they're made immortal or trying to reach this immortality that does not exist. So then you have materials that are on Earth for 200 plus years, or or
longer with nuclear.
yeah, or humans trying to bend the rules of nature and bend the rules of the divine. So beyond how we build cities that mirror, that used like no longer mirror, I wonder also how much of that has to do with our own relationship to our own bodies and our own communities, as in perhaps we've also lost touch as a collective to the divine within us ourselves. Because if that was conscious, that would be a very different narrative.
Very much so. I mean, you and I have talked about death before as being quintessentially natural,
Mhm.
and that it's death and decay are the foundations of life. The great conundrum in trying to work out how on earth life began in the cosmos is, at what point was there enough that had already died to be eaten? And the wonder, if you like, is that at some point something composted sufficiently that life could come out of it. And this is the great conundrum for which there is really no answer. But yes, you're absolutely right. And if we look at Buddhism, Buddhism has a wonderfully powerful teaching that nothing here is real. This is all an illusion. They also, along with the Hindus and the Taoists, believe that the contemporary scientific assumption that the planet Earth is about 4,500 million years old is laughable, because they say, actually, this is about the 10 millionth universe that has ever existed. And secondly, this planet has probably been around for as long as there are grains of sand upon the banks of the river Ganges. So their notion of time is huge, and it is always about rise, top, decline, death, return. We don't have that myth. We have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We don't have a sense of a cycle. And yet, in medieval belief, on the walls of cathedrals, you would have painted the cycle of life, which showed you from birth coming up and going round, and then it all coming round again. So in a sense, we've elevated the importance of the human being, that of all things on the planet, we are the ones that assume we ought to be here forever. And yet I would argue, and I argue this both as a theologian and as somebody who's worked in the environmental movement, I think the human species will be one of the most short-lived species on the planet. I think we'll be gone in 100,000 years' time. We just won't exist. We'll be gone. Probably before that. So one then has to ask, if that's likely, why have we elevated ourselves so much? And there was that interesting conversation, wasn't there, overheard between Putin and President Xi, them talking about immortality. Now, what you have to understand is that the emperors of China have sought immortality for about 2,500 years and have failed. But it has been this perpetual request in order that they could be there forever. One of the methods of trying to seek immortality was to transform the physical body into an incorruptible body, a body that was made up of mercury and gold, because they never rust, they never decay. And so in the quest for longevity, many a Chinese emperor died a very painful early death trying to eat mercury and gold and to dying. And there's a wonderful tension there. So when she talks about the quest for immortality, he knows he is talking about the quest for something that cannot be achieved. When President Putin talks about it, he is doing the usual megalomaniac approach of, if only I could be ruling forever. And again, let's go back to the Greeks. In Greek mythology, you have these great heroes, Theseus, Perseus, Hercules, etc. Who are extraordinary. I mean, they are the supermen, they are the Marvel comic characters of Greek mythology. And you hear how they battle against, I don't know, vast forces and evil forces and God knows what else. That's in their prime. What then we forget when we tell the Greek myths is that the Greek myths tell us how they go old, how they have trouble with their family, how they get gangrene in one foot, or their teeth all fall out and their hair falls out. He speaks with personal feeling here. And then they die. And that's what we've forgotten. We've created the notion that the hero lives forever. Greek mythology tells us, no, they grow old. And Christ says to St. Peter, the person who the church claims it's founded on, he says, when you're old, people will lead you around by your belt because you will be too weak to resist, and you will have to go where they take you. This is the man he said he was going to found his church on, and he's basically saying, Peter, you're going to get decrepit, probably get dementia, and end up in a care home that you didn't want to be in. So we've created myths that are not good myths of being forever, whereas all our great myths have always said, you decline, it falls apart, it rots, it starts again. But let me ask both of you, because here I am, I'm in my early 70s, and notions, and I'm losing friends, they're dying. You're not, you're young. I mean, particularly you, Laila, why are you so fascinated by this issue of death, which goes kind of against the flow of contemporary culture? And yet, whenever I've mentioned that you and I have talked about this with young people, I was at an event last week with young Jains, young Hindus, young Sikhs, they all kind of go, yes. So tell me, why for you?
I have long history with death. Not
That's a very good starter.
I typically say that I've died multiple times in this life. I often say that, and then I'm met with very confused faces. But fair enough. And so learning.
No, Laila, you can't just drop something like that and then say, fair enough. No, unpack it. Come on, this is a discussion, not a series of, and then this amazing thing happened to me which transformed my life, but I'm not going to tell you about it. Yeah, right, get on with it then.
So essentially, they are these moments that you realize there's no going back. There's no going back to who you were a second ago, a minute ago, yesterday. This knowledge and knowing and sudden thunderbolt realization that you are no longer the same. And then the grief process begins, the grieving of an old skin, an old identity, and going through this like very narrow, it's like cave diving. In the earth, you go through crevices and you get stuck, and then you see the light. It is that going in conversation with old skins and then getting into a new dialogue and getting to know a new skin. So when I say I've died multiple times in this life, I mean I've encountered myself reborn multiple times. And my kinship with death is one that has therefore saved me multiple times as well. It is because of death that I've learned how to live. And it is because of my deep respect to death that I feel is our pathway forward, as a collective, as a community, as individuals, to learn how to die, not literally only in this physical vessel, in this incarnation, but to allow ourselves to shed and shapeshift and pivot and enter new skins and new modalities, knowing that this is the divine cosmic course of life and nature, and it is the most generous space I've encountered. It is bloody and gory, but it is precisely the kind of pain that you forget once you see what you've birthed. It's like a mother who gets into labor. It's so painful and brutal, and it's they say it's one of the most severe pains ever
Painful.
to. Yeah. But then the mother looks at her newborn child and forgets about it all.
Yeah.
Because it was worth it. And
Yeah.
and this is my relationship to death. Going through it, it might be painful and you scream, but you look at your new self or new skin, or even as an artist or a creator, when you write something and you've poured this expression out in the world, you've birthed something. We are creators. That is our divine right as well. So to look at it and remember that it was worth it, and it's continuously worth it, because it will all lead you back to source. It will all lead you back to God.
Actually impressive, actually, I have to say. That was beautifully put. I mean, beautifully put, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. As a Christian, I'm often asked, what's the meaning of the crucifixion, the death of Christ? And I said, well, remember, he rose again. And the point is not that one historical event. It is simply saying we all go through crucifixions. We all go through entering the tomb and thinking, what the hell? And then if we're lucky, we rise again. And it's if you like, it's a pathway that's charted for us through Christ, that even the most terrible deaths, literal deaths, can, if you reflect, which is what Easter Saturday is about, can lead you to the new life. And there's one of the stories that we don't really know in the West, although you may know it, because I know the Coptic church in Egypt has this story. And the legend is Christ is crucified and dies on Good Friday, and then he rises on Easter Sunday. So everyone went, so where did he go? What was he doing on Easter Saturday? I mean, was he on holiday? No, the legend is that he attacks hell, and he smashes down the gates of hell, and he walks in, and with his right hand he raises Adam and all the good men of the past, and with his left hand he raises Eve and all the good women of the past and leads them out. Now, if that isn't a story about the fact that crucifixion and resurrection have happened many times before and will happen many times after, I don't know what is. So for me, that is not an exclusive story. He is not the only one who did it. It is the metaphor, the symbol, the image, the picture for all of us when we go through those times. But you put that so beautifully, seriously. I mean, beautifully put.
No,
Beautifully put.
thank you. That story reminded me of when you said that he slams the gates of hell, and the immediate thought that came to mind is how civil.
Now, come on, what on earth do you mean by that? I mean,
was
I'm
just
sure,
thinking,
I don't think he swore as he did that. I think he was extremely polite and said, "Excuse me, I'm just going to demolish your gates
yeah,
and free all the souls." I'm not sure the devils were so impressed, but what do you mean by civil in that context?
it's what very, very intuitively came to me, and I'll voice it and we can articulate it together. But I thought if there's if we're gonna reclaim and reimagine and redefine civil society and what civil means, I feel like that is a prime example. It is, I don't know, entering with full force in conviction and in integrity to reclaim what's right, um, and restore a right relationship for our earth and our ecologies. I don't know, maybe, yeah, smashing down the gates of hell. I don't know if we draw analogies, how much of that is like to military state, and let that be known as civil, not disobedience. Not obedient. Yeah, not disobedience, but civil.
Civil. Gosh.
Really?
Come on, Constance.
Yeah, that touched me deeply what you just said, because I think that so much of our current understanding of civil, even just in passing conversation, like be civil, I think there's this tone of be polite, almost be the
Don't
good,
upset anybody. Don't
yeah,
upset.
yeah, be nice, but that's not being kind. And I think that when we're talking about civil society and citizenship in relation to the earth and what has made us and breathes us every moment, it is an orientation towards life, towards what is life giving, and it stands up to what is life taking. And it is fierce and it is wild and it's not linear, and it is it is rebellion, not just for the sake of being disruptive, but um, for love, for the deepest kind of love that we know that connects us all. And I I just think it's so powerful to reorient ourselves towards that. And I yeah, I have something else to say about death, but
No, come on, come on, come on.
well, in listening to you both, and it has been one of the greatest gifts of my life to get to sit with Laila so much and hear her talk about death. It has changed me. And we can think of it in so many different contexts, but personally, I I kind of view it in three different ways, that what you discussed, but also there's a walking dead. There's a walking death, which I very much experienced for the first 30 years of my life, just this numbness and sterilization and escapism, not in my body. And I come from a background that it was very fundamentalist, and the body was wrong and the body was sinful and it was a burden and an afterthought. And uh, it was a cage, everything
Yeah,
was wrong
yeah,
all
yeah.
the time. And so because I didn't know this vessel, I didn't love her, I didn't think she had any value or worth, I could not be in intimate relationship with the world around me. That has to come first. And so thankfully, I was brought to my knees in a lot of ways, and um, there were many pathways that opened up for me to, uh, yeah, die to that old self, um, and realize that the contrast is what creates meaning. And so I will misquote this, but it's that death has lost its sting when we really settle into the fact that it's going to happen. And what you were speaking to about the cycles, I've been studying the yuga cycles, and it's so overwhelming when I first started to look at it. And then I just realized this ache of beauty, that it's not a mistake that's this way, that because it's this way, this rise and fall, we get to experience the joy of return. And the I don't know, it's everything, because when you move from that numbness, um and you really come back into your body and you realize that this is divinely designed to, your senses start to wake up. You start to realize that you're not separate from the trees and the rivers, and it is this divine pulse that moves through everything, and we start to really see each other and move into this creative space uh, of possibility. And there's just such richness and wonder and awe there. And like you, Laila, there have been many deaths, and there will be a death of this body. But if I don't recognize that, I'm going to miss it all. And I think that it really is everything in that sense to find our way back to the reality of that and the grief that comes with it, because that's something that in this separation of humanity from nature, we've lost this understanding of death and also the function of grief and its arc and how it takes us from sadness and despair to grace to awe to beauty to possibility. And it's such a powerful thing when we learn how to sit with it.
It is indeed. I mean, it's the basis of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. And the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism is that there is suffering. It's number one. Number two, suffering comes from craving. And what do they mean? What they mean by craving is, if this was, so let's imagine that this is the most astonishing, amazing conversation you've ever had, and you never want it to stop, and yet it has to stop because Laila's got a clock there and she's going to make sure, and she's not going to play all night. So, there's going to come an end to this fantastic conversation, this lovely time the three of us are having. And if you then go, oh, I just want this to last forever, and then you become upset because it won't last forever, you're craving something that cannot last because it's a temporary state. And so the third noble truth of Buddhism is that craving comes from desire. Desire that things never change. And the fourth noble truth is grow up. Basically, what a load of nonsense. Just live for the moment. And that's incredibly important, is that sense that nothing will last. And therefore, impermanence is the most permanent thing there is. And the oldest divination book in the world is the Yijing, from China, 3,000 years old. Do you know what Yijing means? The Book of Changes. Now, this is the major book of divination for China has been. It's shaped everything in Chinese philosophy, and it rests on the assumption that everything changes. We, particularly in the or I would call it the post-scientific world and the industrial world, believe we can have permanence. We build for permanence. We invest for permanence. We assume that if we're trying to be permanent on a planet that's given us a very nice 10,000 years of moderately stable climate. I mean, where I live now in southern England, 18,000 years ago, I would have been 100 feet under ice. Climate change is nothing new. Yes, we've probably aggravated it, but we don't have a right to be here. We don't have a right. We've had a nice spell. We've had a kind of, nice break from the grim reality that the planet really doesn't give a monkeys about us. We are irrelevant to the planet. That's the Gaia hypothesis in succinct form. And so we've got to accept that we are not here forever. But what we are may be here forever. And I go back to this wonderful notion of stardust. And in a sense, your shape-shifting is about, well, what shape is this stardust going to take now? Because this is okay, but, let's be honest, there's as I get older, I think the basic design's a bit creaky. It could have been better done. And there is, of course, the wonderful Jewish story that if you think this world is complex and badly organized and chaotic, You should have seen the previous 936 worlds that God created, because they were really bad. So this sense of change, and one of the saddest things I ever saw, so I don't know if you know, but in Afghanistan, there were the largest surviving statues of the Buddha created when Afghanistan was a big Buddhist country, about 2,000 years ago, through to about 1,000 years ago when Islam came in. Huge statues carved out of a cliff face, vast great ones called the Bamayana Buddhas. And in 2001, the Taliban blew them up as symbols of idolatry. Nothing could be closer to Buddhist teachings than that nothing lasts forever.
Mm-hmm.
But a Japanese Buddhist group, who obviously haven't really quite grasped what Buddhism is about, have spent millions, billions of dollars putting together the largest jigsaw in the world of all the tiny little fragments in order to try and rebuild the statue. Totally missing the point. That cliff face has been there for 100 million years. It'll be there in another 100 million years. We won't be. Those statues were there for 2,000 years. Fine. The people who believed in them have long gone from that area. It's not their faith anymore. This is past. It's going to pass. Everything passes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that thing about dying, so for me, as I said, I have said for years, the crucifixion is a daily event for many people. And for some of them, they're lucky enough to have the resurrection.
Mm.
You've put it into an even bigger concept, really, Laila, which is just to say, yeah, we die. We die emotionally, we die spiritually, we die economically, we die aspirationally, we die in relationships. I honestly think what you said was one of the most succinct summaries I've ever heard. Congratulations. I think so given that, how have you always believed that? And the same for you, Constance. No, you haven't always believed it. You grew up thinking the body and sexuality was impure. So for both of you, was there a moment, for you particularly, Laila, because my guess is, Constance, that once you moved out of the fundamentalist literalism, the whole thing fell apart.
Indeed.
And then you had to find something to fill the void.
Yeah.
And you obviously
Absolutely.
were very successful at it. So, Laila, you sound as though you've thought about this ever since you were a 2-year-old or something. I mean, seriously, was there a moment at which you realized this? Can you remember it, or have you always thought that way?
I think I became like articulate, or let's say a bit more fluent in this, when I turned 21.
What happened?
Roughly.
Why?
Everything crumbled. It was like the tower card shatter. Just kind of discovering everything made sense, but it didn't before somehow. But upon this knowing, it was like, the carpet was pulled from under my feet, and I was presented with a choice. And I think this crossroads of choice was where I began to really turn in my mind more and more on death. But I think it's always been something that I was in touch with, because even when I was a child, with insects or animals, I would feel so at peace when they were just watching them live, and then knowing that, don't know, they might I would, they would pass. I would grab dragonflies from their wings when they were dead and just marvel at the beauty. And I also feel like Egypt's relationship with death is particular.
That's a very good point.
So having grown up with this fabric of knowing, and also my father has said something very special to me once, so I asked him one day why he has faith, and he said, because it's one of the only things that taught him how to really live. To hold, like, to believe in. It's this, and also ancient Egyptians, you know, the entire living, waking, breathing life was for death.
Yes, absolutely so. And of course, you had the stories of Horus and Isis and the rebirth tradition from there. And in fact, the imagery of the Virgin Mary that we think of in Christianity comes from the images of Horus and Isis. Yeah, that's a very good point. Constance, what was the moment that cracked the fundamentalist pace that you were living in?
There were lots of little moments.
Or did it just erode?
This bubble that I was inside of, that everything out here, everything that we're talking about existed, but it was wrong and I couldn't touch it. And so I've always been a very curious gal and had a lot of questions, and that just started to grow in me. And my soul just became very, very thirsty, very, very hungry. And there was a strength that I didn't recognize that just showed up and needed to pivot. And I didn't know it was possible to feel that alone. And it was terrifying. And that probably was the most significant moment of there's no going back. Like you said, Laila, like I've reached the point of no return. And there was a remembrance that I couldn't articulate at the time, but in hindsight, we have a bit more clarity. And thankfully, I kept moving and I kept asking questions. And as I started to do that, like I said, it was like this vitality started to return. Not everything made sense, but it was, there was, I couldn't stop. And it does remind me of Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero's Journey, just in that you cross that threshold, and thankfully soon after you start to meet the mentors and the allies, and those relationships I will be forever grateful for, because people really met me with so much compassion, and that was indescribable.
That's very touching indeed. I mean, taking this broader again, what does this all mean? Not just for us, because I think we're very much on the same wavelength, but we live in a world that is self-elevating and personal growth denying in equal measure, and narcissistic in an astonishing way. I mean, if you look at Trump, he only sees himself. There is nobody else. And I suppose a lot of my work with the faiths is helping them to come back from having retreated, because all the major religions have been under assault from secular society, whether that's Marxism and communism, whether it's fascism, whether it's nationalism, whether it's national identity, etc. And we've been told, oh, you're irrelevant, you're old-fashioned, you've got nothing to say, you're all about sin and sadness and weariness, and you have terrible songs, etc. And my job has been very much to say to the secular world, you are missing so much. You have no idea why the faiths, like your father, Laila, underpins ordinary life at its best and makes it bearable, makes it possible. And it's beginning to change. It's beginning to change, not so much in terms of religions returning to the table, but in terms of exploration of faith and exploration of this extraordinary wisdom. I mean, in the books that we've got, the Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, the Bible, the Quran, etc. These haven't lasted because they were, airport novels. They've lasted because these stories have resonated, particularly at times of crisis. So what do you see as being, particularly this challenging notion of embracing death as a totally natural part of the process? How do we get that to be seen both as totally natural and absolutely divine? How do we do that?
Also, my question to you, funnily enough, so I'll try to trace my thoughts, but I wanted to briefly ask you, when you say that Trump is only seeing himself, is that true? Is he seeing himself really? Or what?
Oh, okay, that's a good. Do you mean no? He isn't. He's seeing himself as a Superman.
Precisely, falsely.
Yes, no, you're well picked up. You're absolutely right. No,
And
you're absolutely right.
I say that only because it's again this kind of like running over the four noble truths, and kind of I feel like what we're picking up on here and the thread across our embrace of death has to do with cutting out the noise and finding silence, and to stand naked, to stand and dare to show up completely unraveled. Constance, the way you've put it, I felt it in my skin that you didn't know feeling this alone was even possible. But it is exactly in this moment of, let's say, existential loneliness where you found God, where you found the biggest embrace, and presence met. So I asked myself how, like, to your question, Martin, would it not be about finding stillness and finding silence and cutting out the noise?
That's a very, my favorite thing from the Hebrew Bible, favorite story, and I'm sure you'll know it, Constance, from the Old Testament, is when the prophet Elijah, everything has gone wrong. Everybody he knew has been murdered. He's had to hide on a mountain. He knows that the Jezebel and the priest of Baal are after him and will kill him if they can get their hands on him. Everything has failed. Everything. It's the most dramatic story of somebody literally driven to the point of despair, utter despair, complete loneliness, Constance, total loneliness. And then he goes to the mouth of a cave in which he's hidden. He stands on the mouth of the cave and he says, God, where are you? And there's a mighty wind that whips the mountain. The rocks are flying everywhere. And, you get the sense he's thinking, oh. And then the text goes, but God was not in the wind. Then there's an earthquake. And the whole place shakes. And you sort of think, oh, yeah, okay, he's got his answer. And he thinks he's got his answer. And then he realizes, no, God's not in the earthquake either. Then there's a fire that rips through. By this time, the poor mountain's probably destroyed. But anyway, fire rips through. And again, God is not in the fire. And then the text says, and then there was a still, small, quiet voice. And it doesn't have to tell you that's God. Because if you haven't got it by now, you never will. But it's that still, small, quiet voice. And I've just done, I read sacred buildings. I help people understand why they face the way they do, what stories are built into the architecture and the design and so forth. And I've just done work for our little local church here, which is 900 years old. And it's all about how this has been the gathering place of the people of this village for nearly 1,000 years. It's where they've come to cry, it's where they've come to party, it's where they've come to ask, it's where they've come to be. And with a filmmaking friend, we've done 11 little videos of different stories of different bits of the building and stories that you can see there. And very brilliantly, I didn't come up with this, very brilliantly, the person who then edited all this said, I know what I want to call this. We said, what? He said, 9 centuries of stillness. And I was really struck by that. So I think you're right, it is that stillness. And one of the interesting features, certainly in Western cities, is that the only place you can go into and just sit and be still, and nobody will try to sell you anything, nobody will ask you why you're there, is a church, or sometimes a temple or a mosque, because that's for you to be still. And there's a wonderful poem by T.S. Eliot, an amazing poet from the 20th century. And he talks about going to a church. You could go to any old church. And he says, you're not here to answer questions. You're not here to satisfy curiosity. You're not here to take away understanding. You're here to kneel where prayer has been valid. But sit still. Listen to what the stones are telling you. So I couldn't agree more. And I suppose, Constance, at what point did you realize that being alone could be transformed into being still?
A very good question. And it was quiet, and that was really terrifying. And because I kind of relating to what you're just talking about, in a lot of our societies, we're just so frantically looking for the answers. You know, we want to know the outcome of everything. We want to know that we're safe. And I think that in those moments of quiet, I started to really understand in my relationship with God is that this is meant to be mysterious. And that I think we're looking for the outcome, we're looking for the answers because we're so tired, because we're in survival mode and we just want to rest, you know? We just don't want to feel this panic anymore. So we think if we have the answers, we'll finally get to rest. But it's in the stillness and in the trusting the mystery and even falling in love with the mystery that we find that true rest. And there's a quote from C.S. Lewis. It's in Lion, Witch in the Wardrobe, I believe. We may have to correct me. But speaking about Aslan the lion, and they ask, is he safe? And they say, no, but he's good. And I think that that was something that I clung to in that time and still do. And it just speaks so much to me about how we can orient our hearts and our bodies. And it's, yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, the Narnia stories. You'll remember, and I remember I grew up in a vicarage. My father was a vicar, a priest. And I can remember having read the whole series of the Narnia stories and someone saying to me, of course, it's a wonderful metaphor for the story of Christ, isn't it? I went, what? What's that got to do with it? Completely missed the point. But what is... You know, some of us take a longer time to get to things. But isn't it interesting the way that probably the most powerful contemporary myth, which is Harry Potter, ends with death and resurrection? And somebody interviewed Rowley and said, did you mean to end with that? And she said, no, but it could not end any other way.
Absolutely.
And I think we need more of those moments. The trouble is that we've seen those notions, reincarnation, rebirth, etc., as old religious ideas, and we're beyond that. And so we dismiss them. And as I say, if you look at the terrible thing, I think, in a lot of the heroic films is that the heroes never actually get old and obscene and decline and rot and die and make stupid mistakes and balls everything up. And we've got to get back to that narrative, because that's not abnormal, it's actually normal. And your brilliant way of putting it, Laila, that this is about, you've got to go through that pain of death and recognize it is a death of somebody who no longer needs to be there, or whose time has gone, or who frankly should never have been there in the first place, which is your fundamentalist period, Constance, by the sound of things. But how do we bring that back into into discourse, into engagement, into narrative, into music, into songs, into storytelling? How do we do that? You two are on the cusp of this. Come on, what are you going to do?
I always say, let's bring back yearning. Let's create and build apparatuses. Is that
Apparatus, yes,
Yes.
yes.
what's the plural?
Apparati, I suppose.
Apparati.
Don't quote me on that. Don't quote me on that. I regularly make up words. Well, it's a terrible thing.
We love it.
Well, it's quite fun, but I used to do a lot of broadcasting for the World Service of the BBC. That goes out to about 400 million people. And I used to do reports on sacred sites, and I used to say, oh, I'm in this amazing Buddhist temple in Mongolia, and I can feel a real fréquence of sacredness, and so forth. and one day a friend of mine said, how do you spell fréquence? F-R-I-Q. And so she said, dictionary? No, it's not in there, because she said it sounds awfully like frisson. I went, yeah. Well, it's a sort of adaptation beyond that. It's even more of a frisson than you would have otherwise. So go on, keep inventing words.
That's great. Yeah. No, I love it. So apparati.
Apparati. You'll have lots of people sending you, no, that's not right. Anyway, keep going.
So creating an in-community apparati of awe, bringing
Yes.
inspiring awe again and yearning. And I think also so much of what we've spoken to, like prior to this, is language, a kind of untangling of words and playing with, just like how we did now, playing with words and inspiring a new kind of taste bud for what you want to express. So by opening spaces where people can ask themselves, what is it that my heart's yearning to express today? And learning to articulate that again, to touch back on what you said about craving, that the craving for answers and the craving for immortality that leads to suffering, right? It's one of the Four Noble Truths, and that craving comes from desire. So I wonder, I started to think how violent it all is, in the sense of keeping people craving. You keep people craving and craving for more, when it's actually just a matter of finding stillness and quieting. And that's where you meet the divine. And knowing that in the divine is also where you meet paradox and contradiction and confusion.
Absolutely.
Because it is not to say that craving cannot exist within the divine. It very well can. It is just a different level. I think this is where also the point of divine choice comes in, where you're handed the space to choose, and let that choice be of integrity to your heart and your soul. So I think, going back to the question of how we may return and reawaken death in our normal day-to-day conversations and lives, is, I think it begins with taming the craving for answers and quieting this noise that just constantly rattles, and to need to know, or need to control, need to fill the space, like you were touching on the beginning of the conversation, where there's these empty spaces, and then cities were built to fill the space. I wonder how much of that is also to do with like somehow our humans' incapacity to sit with space, to sit with silence, to sit with aperture and expansiveness, to breathe and not know the end. Right?
For it not to have a purpose, but just to be.
Just to be.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I want to go back to your use of awe, because I've spent the last 45 years working with the environmental movements, WWF, United Nations Environment Programme, you name them. I've worked with them all. And the saddest thing about that movement is that it is terrified of using emotive language, because you study forests, you plan climate change programs, you adapt and mitigate. And none of that starts with just going, wow. None of it. And we, my group, which I set up with Prince Philip back in the 90s, called the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, we were often brought into big international environmental programs and sustainability programs, sort of rather grudgingly. Well, you know, I suppose we ought to work with the faiths because 80% of people around the world believe in these faiths, as though that was some kind of terrible mistake that secularism would eventually solve. And we were particularly drawn in to work with a project in Kenya at the request of the Kenyan government and of the Christian, Muslim, and Hindu networks in Kenya who ran schools, to work on a program that UNICEF had launched, which was called Education for Sustainable Development. And there were masses of handbooks on education for sustainable development, designed for school children, probably from sort of 11 years upwards, full of information, lots of charts, maps, data, etc., 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 etc. We were asked, could we help design the first ever faith-based education for sustainable development? So we did, and it's been very successful. It's now used in many other countries. But my colleague, who was a Catholic nun, radical person, swore like a trooper. My goodness me. She really did. We should have had a swear box. We'd have been able to pay ourselves just from the way she swore. Anyway, she was wonderful, great character. And she went to an international conference in Nagoya, Japan, of the Education for Sustainable Development movement. And she gave her initial presentation on the work that they'd done, how they worked with the different three communities, and they'd come together and created educational materials. And somebody stood up and said, I'm sorry, what is this nonsense about a faith-based education for sustainable development? What difference can you possibly have? You know, it's the same data, it's the same, what's different about it? And she just said, and it summed up what you were touching, she just said, we start by saying thank you. Thank you for all this. Thank you for the ridiculous abundance and magnitude. Thank you. Then you can start thinking about what you want to do. Without gratitude, all you are is a manager.
Yes. I have a question. So,
Not
because
another, Laila. I was not expecting that. Go on, get on with it.
So indeed, I think returning to praise and appraisal and singing, like singing thanks to all the abundance that is. I wonder how you see this, because you mentioned that, like Narnia, for example, it is so related and it's very much a reflection, right, of the divine. And so Star Wars and Star Trek with the Great Link and Odo. So there's this underlying premise, an assumption that all of this is outside of this world, that it is otherworldly It doesn't belong to this world.
Good point.
And I wonder how much of that is kind of attached to this strategy of fragmentation and severing us from the divine to make us believe that it's therefore if it's unattainable because it's outside of us, and that, you know, going back to the fundamentalist lingo of humans are inherently bad, and
Yeah.
you don't deserve good. So how do we go back to praise and gratitude and return the divine back to it is attainable. It's not otherworldly.
It's a very, very good question. And you're right. You're absolutely right that, in a sense, we can allow extraterrestrial mythologies or places where you can get on the Hogwarts Express by going to platform 9A at King's Cross, where, by the way, so many, particularly young people, have tried to run through the pillar to get on the train. They've had to put people there to stop them.
Gosh.
But you're right. We externalize, even from this planet, those stories. You're absolutely spot on. And one of the earliest criticisms, particularly by a group of Jesuit priests who were radical anti-Vietnam War, and they said, look, Star Wars is making you look to a galaxy far, far away, when what you need to do is look at what's happening in your own country. And I think the other problem, I think we have a problem with narrative, that we are very fearful of having any kind of supernatural. And remember, the word is supernatural. It's not super external, it's supernatural. And we have lost the fact that supernatural means that this world is capable of wonder and awe and extraordinary, and of destruction and of reconstruction and of hitting the wall and coming back. And, you know, it all happens here. But what we've done is we've made that into soap operas, but we've not made it into actual narratives that transfer. So there's a very interesting project, which I'm slightly dubious about, but I'm fascinated by. So the largest single statue in the world, in Britain, will be built in the next 15 years, and it will be about 300 feet high. And it's called something like the Wall of Prayer. And it's 1 million bricks, and each of those bricks has a story that somebody has experienced an answer to prayer in this life, and is giving thanks by contributing a brick to this enormous, the Wall of Faith, I think it's called, the Wall of Promise, something like that. Now, unfortunately, with all due respect to the more evangelical wings of Christianity, their taste in architecture and design is appalling. And it will be probably quite ugly and rather crass. You know, whereas if we Anglicans did it, it would have at least some nice arches and curves and bends. But in a sense, that's what they're doing physically. They're building a physical wall which says, look, there's 1 million prayers that have been answered, 1 million visions, 1 million traumas that this wall is about. Ask. Be there. Open yourself. What if we were to think of enabling and encouraging 1 million different stories to be told of how people went through death and came out the other side, about how it constant. And we're a bit fearful of stories that have a happy ending. But actually, death and resurrection aren't always happy, because basically, if you are resurrected, you just got to go through the whole load of crap again, because it's all going to happen to you all over again. So just bear with it, guys. It's going to come on again, and you will be stronger. You will know more. You will understand more. But it ain't gonna. You're not going to suddenly end up sitting happily in a field looking at the flowers. You're going to be struggling. So I just wonder. I'm intrigued by the fact that there are a million people who want to tell their story, but they're doing it in a brick.
Mm-hmm.
They're making it literally concrete. So what if we were consciously to tap into this huge raft of stories that people are usually too embarrassed to talk about? It's too personal. It's too, you might laugh. You know, you wouldn't understand. Or I can tell you what happened and where I am now, but I don't quite know where it's going. So it's not complete. And we do want completion. We want it to be, and then there was a happy ending and they all lived happily ever after. It doesn't happen that way. So there is a resource out there of narrative, of song, of drama, of dance, of art, that we're not giving voice to. And I helped set up a project with friends at the WWF and with the World Bank funding, which we called 8 Million Voices. And the idea was to try and help people to tell their stories by using their phones to do videos. And it was moderately successful. But then the big kind of environmental groups came in and said, yes, but what we want are stories that do this. We don't want that kind of story. Bit embarrassing, you know. We want stories that fit with, you know, the goals of COP30 or our priority hotspots program for the Amazon. And they missed the point.
Yeah.
They missed the point. So if there's enough people willing to buy a brick, we tapped into that and said, don't buy a brick. Tell your story. Become a storyteller. Sing it, dance it, paint it. Find a picture that sums up that moment. So I think it's more, and I've tried on a number of occasions, not very successfully, to get the religious media to enable people to tell their own stories rather than to tell stories that fit a secular agenda. And it's an uphill battle, but maybe through this, you can be encouraging, you know, 1 million stories to build a wall of awe and extraordinary and of struggle and of encounter. I don't know.
I love hearing that. And I think you touched on something really important about the shame that we all carry in sharing our stories. And I think that's the hard parts, the parts where maybe we see quote unquote failure or struggle. But I think we also carry some shame around what we were talking about, the awe and the joy and the bliss, because in so many ways, it's when you really let that take over your being, it's big and it's powerful. But our nervous systems, you know, I think a lot of us are just learning how to hold that and how to express it. But we were born in stories. We understand ourselves through stories. We know each other through story.
I think this inability to share is really crippling. It's really crippling. And so I'm working with a very interesting group of very young people who are trying to, who are saying to their own generation, you are wasting your lives on social media. You are allowing your gifts, your time to be stolen. You have become passive. You're not active agencies. You become liars because, I've got to really, actually, not much point me rearranging my hair for a snapshot. But, you know, and they're saying, we've got to put these things down. We've got to use them, but we've got to be able to put them down. Otherwise, we are living utterly vicariously on a system that is telling us what is socially acceptable to be excited about, that assumes that we are consumers, not that we are people, and it's destroying our future. And I'm really intrigued by them. They're a dynamic crowd, and I should really introduce you to Lewis, who's the key person in this, who's quite well known. But I do think we are facing a massive assault on our ability to narrate.
Big time.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're out to do, is to change that, I understand.
That's why this podcast, we do this, so we have these conversations that we stumble and fumble, and I want to say, dare we be unfinished?
Yeah, you're very good at the one-liners, Laila. I'm really impressed, to put it mildly. Yeah, I think you're right, and I think what we need is purposeful ambiguity. So when my colleague, as a nun, said, "We say thank you," she didn't say who to. She was talking to an audience filled with people from all sorts of different cultures. It was enough to say, be thankful. The consequences of that, in terms of how you would build that into your life, is up to you. To be unfinished. So, in Britain and in many parts of the world, we have this notion of saying grace before food. Thank you for this food, God, or thank you for this food, Buddha, or thank you for this food, Allah, or whatever. We say thank you. We say thank you. And recently I proposed, and it's beginning to gain some momentum, don't say grace before the meal. Pray before you go shopping. Because what you've got on the table, you chose without any reflection. And then you said thank you. What if, before you went shopping, however you do it, online or actually going to a shop and keeping jobs in progress, what if you actually sat and prayed, dear Lord, dear whoever, whatever, guide me to buy good food, guide me to buy good products, guide me to be thoughtful about the lives that have created this, the lives that have been taken to provide this, the resources that have been used up to make this. That might actually change more than just simply saying, thank you, God, for this lovely food, and then eating it all. What if, and that's unfinished business, that is saying, let us pray so that the consequence of this prayer, before we go shopping, and many families still go shopping on a Saturday together, means that you've now got to make choices. It's unfinished business that you've already dedicated. So I like your challenge. And unfinished is a huge, huge threat to those who believe they're in control.
That's exactly, because being so distracted by social media, or the craving, this desire and this self-fulfilling suffering.
Yes, the craving, the desire, craving, suffering, exactly.
And also the mistake is believing that you have to reach a certain point, you have to eat a certain way, you have to consume, you have to buy certain things to be finished, while the whole point is to be finished.
That reminds me so much of what you asked a while back, like how are we doing this with the arts? And is a slowing down, and it's not about producing something. That's a byproduct, and it's going to happen, and there's going to be beautiful music and poetry and art and conversations and ideas, like those come from it. But we have this incredible gift that God has given us to be creative beings, and to really understand what that internal process is, and to move slowly with it, and to pivot, and to change your mind. And it's so beautiful too when you realize this is not just a concept that creativity is good for our vitality. It's actually in our energy center, in our sacral chakra. Like there's something biological that happens when we choose to birth something into the world, and to be witnessed, and to witness each other. And also, one of the energies that I feel is so powerful, like awe and wonder, is celebration, because I think it grounds. We're saying we're choosing this, we're choosing to create life together. We're choosing to sit in the mystery, and to not move at the pace of the developed, quote unquote, developed world.
I think that's so important. When Prince Philip and I met and I'd written a book for schools on how 8 different belief systems through their creation stories gave us a sense of where we are and why we are on this planet. And we looked at Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, the Yanomamo of Amazon, First Nations Australia, and humanists. And every one of them has a story, which in a sense deals with the why are we here, where did we come to, and where we're going. It kind of, it makes it possible to get up in the morning without going, oh my God, why, where have we come from? Why am I here? It sort of gives you a little bit of a framework. You can then meditate about that after breakfast. That's okay. That works out quite well in my case. So we did this, and the book was hugely successful. First ever book for schools on religion and environment. And then Prince Philip read it, and he was the head of WWF International. And he said, I want you to come and help design with me an event at which we bring the major religions and all the major different environmental groups together. And he said, how are we going to do this? Because I don't want all the religions to be the same. That's not what's interesting. So we came up with this phrase. We invited everybody to come, whether they were humanists or religious, whether they were representing the UN or the World Bank or WWF or Nature Conservancy or whatever. And we said, come, proud of your own traditions and humble enough to listen. And when we did the first meeting, I said, the danger is we'll have lots of papers. Nobody ever reads a paper given at a conference, ever again. It's just true. So we had an artist, we had a composer, we had a poet, we had a novelist, and we had a dramatist. And they created poetry and art and stories and narrative, which are still in use. We did this in 1986. Some of those poems are now in anthologies of poems. They've been in school curriculums. The paintings are in some of the great galleries and in art rooms and in art books. The drama has gone on to be performed in theatres and schools all around the world. That's how it spreads. And I've just been at another conference in Geneva, terribly well-intentioned, utterly boring, because it was all pompous people who had come simply because it was their job to be there, and they delivered their paper. And I was asked at the end, what could we do to improve? And I said, well, cut 90% of the papers, have someone singing, someone composing, someone dancing, someone making a poem, and so forth, because we had no sense of awe in that event. We had a sense of awful, but the awfulness was the terrible speeches. So we've got to get away. And I had a wonderful friend at one of the big foundations who said to me, because I've always said nobody was ever converted by a pie chart. We're changed by stories, only stories. We're a storytelling species. Anyway, this friend of mine who very much agreed with me was running a very big foundation. And he said, everybody assumes that what we want is all the data, all the numbers set out. And he said, do you know why numbers are called numbers? And I went, no, John, I don't know why they're called numbers. He said, because they numb.
Oh,
And I think we've got to break away from the idea that if you have all the data, you have the solutions. You don't.
yeah.
Unless you've got a context within which the data says, that's what I thought. Or, yes, I always felt that. Or, gosh, actually, that means we've been going down the wrong path. But you've got to have a context of purpose and meaning and significance. I'm afraid, much as I am thoroughly enjoying this and hope we can do another one, if you can put up with it, I will have to leave.
Yes.
But before I go, I just wonder whether what I could take away from this is a renewed commitment to awe and to narrative. It seems to me that's why you set this up. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Wow. Then in
This
that
is
case, God bless you.
bless you.
Because this is what we need. And let's continue to talk and to plot and to plan. And I wish I could join you in your piano performance another time. But the fact that you're even doing that is taking a podcast into another sphere that nobody else I know is doing. So I think you're on the right way. I really do. I think it's fascinating and exciting, and it'll never be finished, as you just pointed out to us, Laila.
We are
But it's going to be a
finished.
fantastic journey, a fantastic journey. I really do
Martin.
think that. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you both.
This is the Shapeshifting